Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
Welcome to a new year, and we're going to start the new year off with a little bit of news. Adam and I haven't done a news update in a while, so here's some stories that we found interesting that we're going to talk about. The first one I wanted to mention is a few weeks ago, actually it's been a couple months now, Adam and I did a story about Sophos and their report on how they played this cat and mouse game with a bunch of Chinese state actors, and they even ended up installing some of their own implants or surveillance type code within the Chinese hacker Sophos devices to monitor and preempt the Chinese actors at exploiting their firewalls. It was a great report. Go back and listen to it if you haven't. We have the full report in the show notes a couple months back. But on a follow-up of that, a couple weeks ago, a federal court in Hammond, Indiana, unsealed an indictment where they're charging Guan Tianfei, a citizen of the People's Republic of China, for his involvement in a conspiracy to hack indiscriminately into those firewalls worldwide. And as it alleges in the indictment, in 2020, Guan and his co-conspirators developed, tested, and deployed malware that targeted approximately 81,000 Sophos firewalls using a zero-day vulnerability that existed on those devices. The 81,000 firewalls were located throughout the world, including the victim organization located in the Northern District of Indiana. And then the vulnerability was later designated as CVE. Guan and his co-conspirators designed that malware to steal the information from the firewall, and to better hide their activity, they registered and used domains that looked like they were controlled by Sophos, like sophosfirewallupdate.com. Very, very smart. Sophos discovered the intrusion and then remediated its customers' firewalls approximately 2 days later, which caused the co-conspirators to modify the malware. And then as modified, the malware was designed to deploy encryption software from a ransomware variant in the event the victims attempted to remove the malware. They didn't succeed, but it did demonstrate the conspirators' disregard for harm that they would cause to the victim. The U.S. Department of State announced rewards today up to $10 million. So this indictment was done on December 10th. So it's been a few weeks, but up to $10 million for any information leading to the identification or location of Guan or any other person while acting under the direction or control of a foreign government. So I just thought this was really interesting because we did that report, and then the U.S. government actually went ahead and took some action. Now, these are just indictments. They also announced some sanctions today, but I think it's a little bit more symbolic because they don't actually have them in hand. But if they ever do get caught at the border or whatever, obviously these charges are going to be there, and they're going to be arrested on those. So a nice little update on the story that we did.
Yeah, I love following these stories long term and seeing how they develop. And I personally feel like there's been a little bit of when there's been, let me back up a step. I realize there's more going on we don't see, especially when it comes to statecraft, diplomatic relations, or lack of relations between countries. A lot of that doesn't happen in the public eye. I understand that. However, it has felt like for a while now, when there are state actors involved in these cyber attacks, there's a little bit of like shrug your shoulders and go, oh, well, what are you going to do? Like, it's felt like a little bit of, nothing we can really do. We got to harden our defenses, and they really shouldn't be naughty and do that to us. But I like seeing like some concrete steps taken. Like you said, Andy, even though we don't have the alleged perpetrator in hand or other members of their team, there's at least the potential for legal jeopardy should they enter the United States in the future, or attempt to enter the United States, or even enter a country in which we have an extradition agreement with. So certainly it just is nice to see something tangible happen as a result. So that's encouraging. Also, just an amazing cat and mouse game that we covered before. But if you missed it the first time, catch the link in the show notes. Go listen to the previous pod on this. It definitely was a very interesting story to follow, and great work by the team at Sophos.
And kind of leading into that next story here, I actually heard maybe a podcast or some news where Chinese car makers are really starting to become a very strong competitor worldwide. We don't see a lot of Chinese cars in the United States because of tariffs and all of that, but in the rest of the world, you go to Europe for sure and Asia, you're going to see Chinese car makers, and what they have really focused on is EVs and specifically software within vehicles. And I think for us, especially like cybersecurity professionals, looking at the security of cars, if you go to like any hacker conference, there's always like people trying to hack cars, hack Teslas, and anything that was software. And for many years, even like the, quote unquote dumb cars had some sort of electronic bus in it that for many years, and I don't know if this is still true, but that bus that does the communication to different parts of the vehicle was unencrypted because they assumed that a vehicle's a closed circuit. But of course, now we have different software that even gets remote updates. As soon as you start opening it up to remote things, then you find vulnerabilities within. So I feel like as cybersecurity professionals, we're already very apprehensive about different electronic things when it comes to vehicles. So when I saw this next story, it was really interesting to me because I didn't even know they existed. So Wired did a story on these digital license plates, which are apparently already legal to buy in a growing number of states and to drive nationwide. And they do offer, I guess, some perks over the traditional sheet metal license plates. Like you can change the display on the fly to frame your license plate number with like a novelty message, or to flag it if your car's been stolen. I do get that can be certainly very attractive to do that. But as we know, anything digital can probably be hacked. And that's exactly what this researcher did at a security firm called IO Active. Joseph Rodriguez revealed a technique that he can jailbreak those digital license plates sold by Rivier, which is the leading vendor of those license plates, which already have sold about 65,000 in the United States. The susceptibility to the jailbreaking could let the drivers with the license plate evade any system that depends on the license plates for enforcement, like tolls or speeding or parking tickets, or if the police are trying to track criminals. Basically, once you jailbreak it, you can put whatever you want on the screen. And because the vulnerability exists at the firmware hardware level, the chips themselves, Rodriguez says there's no way to patch the issue with a mere software update. They would have to replace those chips in each display, which means that it's probably going to stay because that's not something that the company is probably willing to do for a vulnerability, which is unfortunate. And so now you have this problem with thousands of license plates that are vulnerable to this jailbreaking technique. So, like I said, I didn't even know that these existed. As a cybersecurity professional, I would be very weary from changing from a physical thing to a digital thing. And like I just traveled to Asia recently, and as going through the customs and immigration, there are new stalls that were really quick that people could go through if they had a digital passport. But I still, of course, had my old trusty paper one. And people have been forging, paper passports or physical passports forever, right? Like you watch like Jason Bourne and he takes out like his, stack of physical passports. But I also feel like, digital passports could be something that could also be forged and hacked at some point. So we'll see. Of course, we have these digital license plates and now we have a way to hack them. And so I think this is still probably a few years out before we, switch to something like this. And hopefully by that time, the security will be much more substantial. I just question, like, did somebody at this company who's selling these license plates, do they have a cybersecurity professional on the development team? Was this even a thought that, it's really cool to be able to put a border around your license plate, but yeah, of course, the first thing criminals are going to do is try to hack it.
I'll give them a little bit of grace here. It sounds like he found a vulnerability at the hardware level. And that is the creme de la creme of hacks, and obviously they're great for attackers because they're persistent, but they're also really hard to find, and they require probably the most specialized expertise. I mean, this is where you need literal people with master's degrees on up in computer engineering to really understand and help you find those. That's tough, for sure. It's not to say it's not possible, right? There's 3 companies that ship a ton of hardware into hostile environments that maintain their integrity: Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft. All of their game systems have, hardware-based root of trust all the way through code execution, where they don't execute untrusted, unsigned code at any level. And despite there being millions of those devices out in the wild, there don't exist, at least that I'm aware of, any at-scale exploitations for that hardware. Maybe there were in first-gen Switches or something. Nintendo is usually not quite as good as the other two, but I digress. The point is, it is hard to ship something that is effectively going into a hostile environment. And that's what this is, where the users are incented, at least some users are incented to want to break into these things and mess around with it. So you are effectively shipping it to people who are trying to break it. That's most analogous, again, to video game systems, because people would love to jailbreak them and be able to run pirated software on them and not pay full price for video games. And yet that's really not happened in the last couple generations of video game consoles. So it is possible, but it does require a ton of investment and work. And, with a lot of these companies, I haven't heard of this organization, probably a startup where somebody had a fever dream and said, we should do a digital license plate. Let's build a team together and ship something. And, the startup model is ship fast and break stuff. And cybersecurity often gets left behind, and it kind of needed to lead with this. It's not surprising to me. I give grace because it's the hardest thing to get right. But yeah, it's 0% surprising. Now, to be clear, because it is a hardware exploit, it does require physical access to the device. But again, if you're a bad criminal or something and you got your hands on one of these, hey, you can drive around with your plate all normal, and then when you want to go into Ghost Protocol, you could. And that is less than desirable.
All right. This next story I saw and I thought was really interesting because I didn't know that the most popular home internet router brand in the United States was TP-Link. And that brand may be banned from sale in the country over fears of national security in the next year, probably. So 3 separate U.S. agencies have opened investigations into TP-Link routers, which account for 65% of the U.S. market, in part because badged versions are supplied to customers by more than 300 ISPs. So the Wall Street Journal reports that U.S. authorities are investigating whether a Chinese company whose popular home brand internet router have been linked to cyber attacks and whether or not they pose a national security risk, and are considering banning the devices. And investigators at the Commerce, Defense, Justice Department have all opened their probes into the company, and they're looking at possibly banning these routers next year. So it has been, I guess,
which is this year now, by the way.
Right, this year, yes. And so, apparently it's been a long worry that a lot of these ISPs have been choosing the same routers made by TP-Link, given the frequency that they've shipped with security flaws, which the company has failed to patch. And they've also been purchased by some sensitive government agencies. And now federal contracting documents show TP-Link routers supply everything from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, to the Defense Department and drug enforcement agencies, and the routers are also sold at online military exchanges. The Wall Street Journal reports that TP-Link routers may have effectively also been used as a botnet to carry out cyber attacks on U.S. organizations, including suppliers to the Department of Defense. An analysis from Microsoft published in October found that Chinese hacking entities maintain a large network of compromised network devices comprising mostly of thousands of TP-Link routers, and the network has been used by numerous Chinese actors to launch cyber attacks These actors have gone after Western targets, including think tanks, government organizations, non-government organizations, and Defense Department suppliers. And now DOJ is investigating whether the price discrepancy violates a federal law that prohibits attempts at monopolies by selling products for less than they cost to make. So they're trying to see, apparently, and that makes sense. It's so ubiquitous because matched up against the competitors, it's been cheaper, but maybe they've been selling them for less than what they make, which violates a federal law. So really interesting. I'm glad that I don't have any TP-Link routers, but I do have TP-Link things. Like, they also make smart devices. So Kasa, which is a offshoot brand of smart plugs and other things, they make those, and it's a TP-Link company, which I have many of. But fortunately for me, and maybe for some people who are using these, my smart plugs only operate locally using Bluetooth. So it doesn't work over the internet, which now I'm kind of happy of. But I think, Adam, you have some thoughts on this because you might have a few TP-Link devices.
It's all I have. My entire network is TP-Link. They have been recommended by the Wirecutter as their top pick now for many years, and they're excellent. Okay, it turns out maybe it sounds like their firmware is updated a little slow. I do stay on top of my firmware updates, of course, as a cybersecurity professional, so I haven't noticed if there's been like a 0 day that took long to patch or whatever, but they do get updates, and I do deploy them. ISPs deploying stuff that doesn't get timely firmware updates is a tale as old as time. That is certainly not unique to TP-Link or anything else. I mean, ISPs are terrible at that sort of thing. So the one ISP partnership I've seen that has worked really well, total side note, is I've had a couple of ISPs actually distribute Eero equipment, and Eero does a great job at patching all of the time, all by itself, and very seamless and automatic. And it's not even like you have to go search it out. You don't have to be a seeker. It just happens, and that's really great. Even with this TP-Link stuff, it'll download the firmware, but it'll still sit there till you go to like the app and install it, which, let's be honest, muggles are not doing. Normal folks are not doing. Yeah, I mean, that's still problematic. But as far as like the performance, it's incredible. I never really price compared. Usually when I need something, I just go to the Wirecutter and be like, what's the top choice? Okay, I'll go buy that. And they've been recommending this stuff for years. And in all honesty, it's been really pretty great. So yeah, this is concerning. By the way, Andy and I both work for Microsoft, although not in our threat intelligence center that probably issued this analysis. Andy and I are in our field sales selling cybersecurity software, but just like to point that out because Microsoft got mentioned here, and then we'll also talk about GitHub in a moment, which is a Microsoft company. So yeah, this is super interesting. You know, when I first saw this came through, I kind of said, is there something here? Or is this kind of the typical fear mongering of, oh my gosh, it's China and it's communism and we got to wipe this out? It sounds like there's something actually here, potentially. It doesn't sound so much like it's all one thing, though. Like this is death by 1,000 cuts. It's potentially they're selling their stuff for less than it costs to make. Okay, that's one thing. It sounds like potentially they don't do a good job at self-patching and issuing firmware updates in a timely fashion. And so unpatched, unupdated devices have been used as part of botnets. What this does not, none of this suggests, to be clear, is that there are backdoors or there are like systemic security problems with them beyond problems with patching. That's really the crux of this is what comes down to is don't like their business model, don't like what they're selling it for, don't like how ubiquitous it becomes, don't like it's a Chinese company and their firmware patches are issued too slow or too cumbersome to install, and so they're being used as part of botnets. Okay, that's fair. Is that a reason to ban it from the country? I mean, maybe if it's death by 1,000 cuts, and again, there's been this push of, well, we really don't want adversarial nations in our networks. And I understand that because if you're in the network, even as we're trying to adopt zero trust models, and Andy, you just talked about with cars, how older cars communicate over an unencrypted bus because they assumed it was a closed loop. Even as we try to get to zero trust, where there shouldn't be anything that you can just sniff off the wire now in a modern zero trust network, we know that's not utopia. We're probably never going to get there. And so there would be a wealth of information if there were alleged backdoors or anything, which again is not what this is suggesting. So an interesting developing story for sure, especially when it is the most popular and well-regarded and highly recommended brand could potentially no longer be doing business here. But it's not unprecedented. I mean, we look back at Huawei a couple of years ago, and their smartphones were very well regarded. They were considered some of the best Android phones you could get, well reviewed, well loved. And then it was just like, yeah, I can't get those anymore. Sorry. So it's not like it's unheard of. And I get, again, there are bigger dynamics here than just that. But it's I always come at this with the skeptical eye of is this statecraft? Is it xenophobia? What is this? Or is there something really here? And in this case, my employers weighed in and said, yeah, hey, there was a Chinese hacking entity that has a army of compromised network devices, and they're all TP-Link. And so that's certainly interesting as to note. So a developing story for sure, but could be a huge story. And I was surprised when this came across the wire the other day, Andy, in our group chat with our buddies, that this hasn't been publicized more.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big deal. And again, it's not like the devices you already have in service are going to stop working. And, the great thing about networking is it's all based on standards and protocols. And so it's not like if I haven't intentionally built an all TP-Link network, it's just been their stuff is cheap and it's really good and it's reliable. But if I have to start bringing in other brands to my network, it's not like it's not going to work. So that's the good.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Huawei because that's exactly what I thought of. Huawei and ZTE were both fairly well-regarded companies, and they were banned in the United States. And like I said, I just went to Asia, and when I was looking at some cell phone company, out there at the department stores and whatnot, I saw Huawei phones, and I was like, wow, I haven't seen those in a minute. And they're nice phones, but being manufactured in China, being a Chinese company, supply chain attack can be something that could happen with the Chinese government. So I get it. And yeah, 65% of all routers in the United States are TP-Link. So it's definitely going to have an impact if this was banned.
Yeah. Someday, and this is way above my pay grade, I'd love to get an explanation for why Lenovo gets a pass in all this.
Interesting.
But that's a conversation for another day.
All right. The final thing that I wanted to mention is GitHub. This was kind of a surprise because I have a personal GitHub account, and as Adam mentioned, GitHub is a Microsoft company, although they're pretty much get to operate on its own.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really, not to say that they're not part of the mothership, but they're have
their own company.
They are their own company. And so GitHub launched a GitHub Copilot free, which was a new tier. And GitHub Copilot actually, I think, is the most mature Copilot of all the Copilots. It was probably the first one to come out and roll out to actual customers. My brother-in-law is a developer, and he purchased GitHub Copilot, just a personal license. I think it was like $15 a month or something like that to help him code. And so now they have this new free tier, which anyone who has a GitHub account can use, and it allows developers to use GitHub Copilot within Visual Studio Code for free. So you do have to use Visual Studio Code as your coding platform, but it gives you 2,000 code completions and 50 chat messages per month just by signing in with a personal GitHub account. They do offer the choice between Anthropic's Claude 3.5 Sonnet or OpenAI's GPT-4 model, which lets users ask coding questions, explain existing code, find bugs, execute edits across multiple files, and access third-party agents or build their own extension. The launch of Copilot Free coincides with GitHub reaching the milestone of 150 million developers on the platform, which emphasizes GitHub's commitment to providing accessible AI-powered coding assistance to developer community. So I thought this was really cool. I use Copilot sometimes to analyze code. And, if you are a developer, this can be immensely helpful, especially if you cannot afford to pay for a subscription, or if you're a student and you're trying to learn. There's now this free tier for you to use on a limited basis, but still it's free. So pretty nice. We like free stuff.
We all do. For sure, Andy, you're correct. I believe this was the first Copilot to really be monetized, to really go to market. And the feedback from customers continues to be, we see easily the largest return on investment of any Copilot in this one, which is not to say they don't love other Copilots too. But this one, they say the ROI is just off the charts on this. Like, couldn't live without it. It makes developers so much faster and more efficient. The problem is there hasn't been a good way to trial it, kick the tires on it. And it turns out if there's one thing these LLMs are really good at, it's code. They're really good at it, and they have been since their inception. And so it's just an incredibly value-added benefit to anyone who uses it. And now more people can try it than ever before. And that's really beneficial too. Yes, for some people who just can't afford it or can't justify the investment but may need it occasionally, awesome. That's great when you can occasionally access this when you need it. But for a lot of people, it might be their first time seeing it. And seeing is believing. And if you've still never used an LLM to help do this paired programming with you, it will blow you away. I've yet to meet anyone other than the most hardened curmudgeon who is not blown away at the benefits this can bring to almost any developer of any skill level. It truly is incredible. So this is exciting. And one of the things that people will probably make a lot of here is, you mentioned the choice between Anthropic's Claude 3.5 Sonnet or GPT-4o from OpenAI, and point to Microsoft's partnership with OpenAI. And the thing is, yeah, it's a great partnership. Media stories notwithstanding, but it's good for everyone that if we focus on what the solution is and not what the underlying model is. When we get to a day when we don't have to care what model it's running on, because the thing does the thing it helps me with. Paul Thurrott is kind of famous in saying, I will pay for a service, I'm not paying for AI. And what he means by that is, if you have a service that says, I help you write code faster, it's like, I'll pay for that. If you're like, here's an AI service that uses this model and does this whiz-bang thing, he's like, I'm not paying for that. I want to know what the benefit to me is. What am I getting out of it? And so moving to a day when the models are kind of disintermediated from the end result, because you shouldn't have to care about that. That should be abstracted away. It should just be the service picks the right model for whatever you're trying to do, and you get the best outcome, and you don't need to care about that. And so that is the goal for everyone. And we have all sorts of great models. Anthropic's doing great work. OpenAI is doing phenomenal work. Microsoft's got some SLMs and LLMs they're building internally that are great. And so that is cool too. That really jumped out at me as we're walking through this news story, is that it offers the choice of models, and that's swell. I look forward to the day in which the system automatically picks the model and we don't even have to care about it or even track all these changes, because my goodness, do they come fast and furious. And didn't OpenAI just did like a 12 days of Christmas or something where they released like 12 news announcements in 12 days. And it's just, I can't even come close to keeping up with it. And I kind of look forward to the day when it's like I just can get a solution and it just does the thing and I don't have to worry about all that stuff. But, as technologists, it is fun to geek out over it. And the rate of advancement right now has been really fun. But getting back to the point at hand, if you're a developer, Visual Studio Code, sign in with a GitHub account, and you're off and running, and you can kick the tires on this. Try it out, or you can use it part-time when you need it. Great news.
All right. That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. I'll put the links to the stories that we talked about on the show in the show notes, and our contact information will be there as well if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.